Oh, you thought the British monarchy was just about tea, biscuits, and waving from stone balconies? Think again. What if I told you that while you were sleeping, a quiet coup went down behind the reinforced mahogany doors of Buckingham Palace, and the House of Cards has finally collapsed? Grab your popcorn, folks, because it is officially happening. The ink is dry, the lawyers have left the building, and the royal scoreboard has been completely wiped clean. At exactly 9:15 a.m., an emergency sovereign declaration dropped like a tactical nuke on the royal household, declaring that Prince George is now officially locked in as the unalterable, untouchable direct heir to the realm. But wait, it gets infinitely juicier. This isn't just about giving a 9-year-old boy a shiny new constitutional shield. It is about the absolute, devastating, cold-blooded banishment of Queen Camilla's inner circle. Yes, you heard that right. In a shocking twist that has left the palace staff in a state of absolute existential panic, Camilla's children, Tom Parker Bowles and Laura Lopez, have been systematically, legally, and permanently removed and excluded from every emergency succession plan, regency contingency, and behind-the-scenes crown estate power grab. Did Prince William finally pull the ultimate chessboard maneuver? Did Princess Anne find the hidden legal loophole to safeguard the direct bloodline from a blended family takeover? And how on earth is Queen Camilla reacting now that her carefully constructed alternative center of power has been reduced to absolute dust? Grab your seats, because we are unpacking the most scandalous, high-stakes royal eviction of the century. An excellent example of how this ongoing palace chess match plays out visually can be seen in this deep-dive commentary on Prince William's strategic maneuvers, which highlights exactly how these intense, behind-the-scenes legal standoffs operate when family dynamics clash with the survival of the crown. The palace corridors didn't echo with a dramatic shouting match, but the digital server networks of the British monarchy fell under immediate and absolute lockdown the second that emergency instrument was validated. To truly understand why the royal household has descended into a state of total, suffocating informational blackout, you have to look at the meticulous paper trail that led to this catastrophic explosion. For the past 18 months, a quiet, strategic conflict has been unfolding beneath the surface of routine royal appearances, a war fought not with public declarations, but with hidden audits, altered digital ledgers, and restricted biometric security access keys. The public saw a unified modern family standing together at state events, but behind the closed doors of the Windsor archives, an entirely different operational matrix was being constructed. A faction within Queen Camilla's administrative circle had quietly begun drafting proposals that threatened to permanently shift the institutional boundaries protecting the minor heir, Prince George. This was not a minor administrative rearrangement. It was a calculated attempt to insert an alternative center of family influence directly into the long-term governance of the sovereign estates, and it represents the most significant constitutional overreach witnessed in the modern era. The friction turned radioactive when senior curators operating under the strict directives of Princess Anne discovered that a dormant estate memorandum had been systematically revived and edited without the knowledge or consent of the Constitutional Secretariat. This hidden document outlined a plan to grant Tom Parker Bowles an unprecedented, highly privileged role as a permanent family liaison, an executive position that would provide him with unmonitored access to Prince George's scheduling, personal correspondence, and future household planning in the event of an emergency. The discovery of this paperwork was treated by Prince William not as a well-meaning safety measure, but as an existential threat to the integrity of the direct line of succession. The legal response was instantaneous and surgical, utilizing specialized crown property mechanisms dating back to 1952 to bypass the sitting monarch's personal household preferences and enforce an absolute containment zone around the direct heirs. King Charles found himself trapped in a state of agonizing constitutional paralysis, facing a brutal ultimatum presented by his sister and his eldest son. He could either allow the silent overreach to continue and face a devastating public high court battle over the execution of his mother's private trust mandates, or he could sign a brutal sovereign declaration that would permanently humiliate his wife by name. The king chose the crown over his domestic peace, authorizing an explicit, binding declaration that officially removed every path of informal influence by which the Parker Bowles line could ever touch the future sovereign. The resulting document did not merely clarify boundaries. It erected an unyielding legal firewall that stripped Camilla's children of any potential emergency standing, leaving her inner circle in a state of absolute, reeling disbelief. This sudden, public eviction has shattered the carefully constructed facade of the blended modern monarchy, revealing a bitter generational war over who truly controls the physical and legal legacy of the House of Windsor. The shockwaves from this decision have completely paralyzed the palace press offices, forcing every senior staff member to sign strict non-disclosure agreements under the immediate threat of the Official Secrets Act as the administration scrambles to contain the fallout. The institutional mechanics that allowed a prince and a princess to effectively overrule a queen consort are deeply rooted in the specialized fine print of British property law, where title does not always equate to actual operational power. Queen Camilla has spent years meticulously expanding her footprint within the royal foundation, shaping the administrative infrastructure of the household to mirror her own long-term modernization objectives. However, her authority as queen consort allows her to manage current household logistics, but it does not grant her the legal power to override the permanent trust frameworks established by previous sovereigns. Princess End, acting in her official capacity as the lifelong executive of the private estates, possesses a binding legal voice that operates entirely independent of the sitting monarch's marital hierarchy. When the audit team discovered that the digital security profiles for the Sandringham West Wing had been modified to allow unmonitored access to the private quarters, the preset legal alarms within the trust deeds were automatically triggered. This meant that the very act of attempting to streamline and modernize the administrative offices became the exact mechanism that locked Camilla's team out of the building. By midday, every biometric, key code, and access profile issued to her architectural and administrative staff was instantly revoked by the estate server network, leaving contractors standing outside the locked iron gates. The scale of this internal collapse is unprecedented, with leaked financial documents showing that the legal fees for this fast-moving dispute have already crossed £450,000 in less than 7 days. This capital is being drained directly from private royal funds to pay for high-stakes constitutional solicitors billing by the hour to resolve a family war that has effectively divided the monarchy into two distinct, competing factions. On one side stands the ceremonial shell of the current reign, managing public appearances and state dinners, while on the other stands the unyielding alliance of William and Anne, who control the actual property, the archives, and the legal future of the crown. The public narrative has quickly devolved into screaming front-page headlines declaring that George has been secured while Camilla's family has been completely cashed out, creating an environment of intense public scrutiny that the palace is completely powerless to stop. This public exposure is exactly what the palace inner circle feared most, as it forces a deeply personal family structure to be dissected by constitutional commentators and broadcasters worldwide. The human cost of this sudden institutional quarantine has rippled directly through the private lives of those who thought their proximity to the throne had secured their permanent dignity within the institution. Tom Parker Bowles reportedly received the formal notification of a status change via a concise, official telephone briefing from a senior estate manager, informing him that all future family gatherings involving Prince George would proceed entirely without his presence. The shift from informal inclusion to explicit, named exclusion represents a brutal public demotion for a private individual whose only crime was existing within the orbit of an ambitious household modernization plan. His security clearances were quietly downgraded, his name was systematically scrubbed from private guest lists, and his long-standing administrative access points were completely dismantled within a matter of hours. This clinical, legal execution has left Queen Camilla's family feeling publicly branded as a threat to the direct line of descent, a historical stigma that no amount of public relations spin can ever truly erase. Laura Lopez has reportedly reacted with a controlled, painful retreat from the royal ecosystem entirely, requesting that no public campaigns or corrections be launched by her mother's office to recover the lost privileges. The emotional distance growing between the queen consort and her children is the direct result of a constitutional system that views family members not through the lens of personal affection, but as operational variables that must be regulated to protect the sovereign line. Camilla's fury at this public humiliation is driven by the realization that her husband ultimately chose the survival of the monarchy over her family's standing, a reality that leaves her deeply isolated within her own household. She was forced to watch her carefully planned administrative expansion crumble under the weight of a dossier so legally sound that even the king's personal advisors warned him that any resistance would be utterly catastrophic for his reign. The conflict has reached a point where the old codes of palace diplomacy are completely broken, replaced by an aggressive legal strategy designed to ensure that the direct line remains completely untouched by the complexities of a blended household. This legal warfare has created total paralysis within the executive wings of Buckingham Palace, where staff members are now forced to operate under the constant scrutiny of independent trustees who are monitoring every digital transaction and archive entry. The confrontation that sealed this dynastic blockade occurred during a secret, behind-the-scenes summit where Prince William presented the intercepted memoranda directly to his father, exposing the hidden paper trail that had traveled between private offices for weeks. The documentation included a series of electronic tracking signatures showing that staff members had intentionally tried to bypass the standard constitutional checkers to slip the liaison proposal into the emergency continuity binders. The evidence was so undeniable that it effectively ended any possibility of a quiet compromise or a polite administrative adjustment. King Charles was forced to accept that the ambiguity he had permitted within his household had created a legitimate structural vulnerability that his sister and his son were completely unwilling to ignore. Princess Anne's blunt, accurate assessment that the crown could not maintain two separate definitions of family, one based on affection and another activated whenever authority became available, served as the final, unyielding argument that broke the king's hesitation. He ordered his constitutional counselors to work through the night to draft an absolute sovereign instrument that would systematically strip every possible avenue of informal influence away from his stepchildren. The counselors went after emergency advisory roles, private archive access, estate consultation permissions, and inherited ceremonial expectations, dismantling each individual channel until no connection remained between the Parker Bowles line and the future sovereign. The resulting document was secured by dawn, setting up a hard chronological countdown toward the upcoming centenary celebrations, which have now been completely overshadowed by this internal war. The palace is now facing a desperate race against time to project an image of stability to a nation that is watching the core architecture of the royal family reconfigure itself in real time. The focus of the crisis has now shifted from the legal boundaries of the estate to a far more volatile investigation involving the literal contents of the late Queen's private life and the missing historical artifacts that hold the key to the family's true narrative. The vanishing of the red leather dispatch box created an immediate tactical crisis that completely shifted the focus of the investigation from future organizational charts to the immediate security of the royal archives. This legendary repository, crafted meticulously by the Wick-Warren Company for the exclusive personal use of Queen Elizabeth II, held the unredacted truth of the family's internal struggles across a 70-year reign, including private diaries and confidential correspondence regarding the long-term management of the private wealth. The discovery that this specific trust-protected artifact had been quietly removed from its high-security vault in the Sandringham West Wing triggered a direct confrontation between the security details assigned to the respective factions of the household. Princess Anne's legal battery did not waste time with administrative inquiries. They immediately filed formal injunctions to freeze the movement of all private assets across the country, establishing a total legal blockade around every archive storage facility operated by the Crown. The Royalty and Specialist Protection Unit was forced to execute a comprehensive data dump of the digital security logs, tracking the movement signatures of every staff member who had entered the Northern Corridor during the late-night hours of March 27th. The electronic trail led straight back to a terminal assigned to a trusted senior administrator within Queen Camilla's personal office, revealing that the security profiles of the estate had been altered without the authorization of the constitutional checkers. For Prince William, This was the definitive confirmation that the push for institutional access was not a hypothetical policy discussion, but an active, covert operation designed to control the historical narrative of the monarchy before the current reign reached its natural conclusion. The atmosphere within the secure residences degenerated into total hostility as independent investigators, backed by high court warrants, began cross-referencing every long-term personal loan entry in the digital asset ledger. The legal reality of the situation was absolute, as British trust law dictates that any unauthorized reallocation of crown artifacts by an estate trustee constitutes a severe, actionable breach of fiduciary duty. The missing dispatch box effectively became the ultimate piece of structural leverage, stripping Queen Camilla's faction of their ability to negotiate or claim that their intentions were purely practical. The financial fallout from this institutional asset freeze began to bleed directly into the public sphere as international banks and wealth management firms in the City of London received formal notifications regarding the contested status of certain private royal accounts. The legal costs, which had already put an enormous strain on the private sovereign funds, continued to climb exponentially as teams of high-stakes corporate solicitors began drafting extensive defense briefs for what looked like an impending high court showdown. King Charles found himself facing an unprecedented internal rebellion, with his sister openly refusing to authorize the release of seasonal estate budgets until a full, independent audit of the Queen's household expenses was completed. This financial stalemate meant that major conservation projects at Sandringham and Balmoral were instantly suspended, leaving hundreds of specialized architectural contractors locked out of the properties while their security clearances were subjected to intense re-verification protocols. The sudden halt of these long-planned operations could not be hidden from the public, as local news crews began filming the empty construction zones and the heavy transport vehicles idling outside the iron gates of the Norwich entrance. The palace press office was caught in a devastating double bind, unable to explain the operational stoppage without exposing the fact that the inner core of the royal family was actively suing itself over the control of historical property. The situation was compounded by the fact that the Constitutional Secretariat had launched a parallel investigation into the lineage of the digital signatures used to authorize the transfer of the files, looking for signs of systemic collusion among senior staff members. Every executive secretary and administrative assistant within the palace was subjected to rigorous polygraph testing and comprehensive communication reviews, creating an environment of deep suspicion where no one dared to speak outside of official, recorded channels. While the administrative machinery of the crown was grinding to a total halt, the psychological impact on the individual family members began to manifest in a series of highly tense, unscripted encounters across the secure zones of the estate. Queen Camilla reportedly requested a private audience with the Prince of Wales at Windsor, attempting to bypass the legal wall that his solicitors had built around his office, but her path was physically blocked by senior protection officers operating under the direct authority of the estate trustees. This unprecedented breach of internal protocol made it clear that the traditional respect for the marital hierarchy of the monarch had been entirely superseded by the cold, legal demands of dynastic survival. The queen consort was forced to realize that her position, while spiritually and publicly elevated, possessed no actual jurisdiction over the physical infrastructure that housed the direct line of succession. Her frustration was echoed by her inner circle, who watched their long-standing access privileges evaporate as the server networks continued to systematically revoke their network credentials. Tom Parker Bowles was spotted by photographers leaving his London residence with a look of absolute, stone-faced exhaustion, refusing to answer questions about his sudden removal from the upcoming state guest lists or his complete exclusion from the ceremonial planning committees. The social fallout was instantaneous, as high society invitations were quietly rescinded by aristocratic families who realized that any association with the Parker Bowles line was now viewed by the future king as an act of direct disloyalty to the throne. The clinical efficiency of this social and legal quarantine proved that the alliance between William and Anne was not merely trying to correct an administrative error. They were executing a permanent, generational purge of informal influence. The internal crisis reached a critical legal threshold when the constitutional counselor assigned to review the emergency declaration uncovered a second, dormant memorandum dating back to the early months of the current reign. This hidden document, which had been quietly filed away within a restricted database at the Duchy of Cornwall, proposed a permanent, consultative governance role for one of the Queen's children at a major royal property after the King's death. Although the paper had never received the formal sovereign signature required to become law, its very existence proved that the strategy to build an alternative, permanent base of influence had been active for years, operating quietly in the background while the public focus was directed toward health crises and external family scandals. Princess Anne utilized this discovery to crush any remaining hesitation within the king's mind, presenting the document as absolute proof that the institutional boundaries of the crown had been compromised from within. Charles was forced to accept that his own leniency had created an environment where ambitious court officials felt confident enough to draft unauthorized legacy documents that threatened the sovereign independence of Prince George's future reign. He ordered his legal team to expand the scope of the emergency declaration, authorizing the total, permanent dismantlement of every advisory channel, ceremonial expectation, and estate consultation privilege that had ever been extended to his stepchildren. The resulting legal firewall was designed to be absolute, leaving no room for future reinterpretation, softening, or quiet administrative adjustments by future counselors. The final draft of the instrument was locked in the sovereign safe just as the international media began broadcasting wild, unverified rumors about a massive constitutional restructuring taking place behind the scenes at Buckingham Palace. The pressure on the king's health and emotional stability during this period of intense internal warfare became a major source of concern for the senior medical team, who repeatedly warned the family that the constant stress was actively undermining his recovery protocol. Charles found himself completely isolated, trapped between his deep, personal affection for his wife and his sacred constitutional vow to protect the continuity of the direct line of descent. Every conversation within the private apartments was described by staff as a battlefield, with the Queen consort openly accusing her husband of cowardice and betrayal for allowing his sister and his son to dictate the permanent status of her family. The king's personal advisors from the cabinet office were brought in to explain the stark reality of the situation, showing him that any attempt to challenge the injunctions or suppress the emergency declaration would lead to a catastrophic public scandal that would permanently end the legitimacy of his reign. The institutional machinery of the British state was moving to protect itself, and it was completely indifferent to the domestic happiness of the individual sitting on the throne. Charles was forced to sign the final enforcement orders while sitting alone in his study, surrounded by the historical portraits of ancestors who had made similar, brutal choices to preserve the integrity of the crown at the expense of their personal relationships. The validation of these orders set off a series of immediate, practical changes across the royal households, as security clearances were officially updated on the main mainframe and the names of Tom and Laura were permanently flagged as unauthorized entries within the secure sectors of every sovereign estate. The immediate consequence of this legal enforcement was felt most acutely by the staff members who had spent 18 months quietly facilitating the administrative expansion of the Queen's household. Dozens of senior advisors, public relations specialists, and administrative secretaries were summarily dismissed from their positions, given less than 2 hours to clear their desks under the watchful eyes of independent security officers. These individuals were forced to surrender all palace-issued communication devices, laptop computers, and personal encryption keys, effectively neutralizing their ability to leak sensitive documents to the media or retaliate against the estate trustees. The sudden, silent purge left the administrative corridors of Buckingham Palace completely deserted, with remaining staff members refusing to speak to one another out of fear that their conversations were being recorded by the Constitutional Secretariat's compliance team. The informational blockade was so effective that even senior cabinet ministers were left in the dark, receiving only a brief, formal memorandum stating that the royal household was undergoing a routine structural reorganization to optimize expenditure. But the reality could not be hidden from the national broadcasters, who noticed that the standard communication channels between the palace press office and major news desks had completely broken down, replaced by a cold, formal silence that always precedes a major constitutional announcement. The countdown toward the publication of the partial declaration had begun, and the family was now trapped in a desperate struggle to control the external narrative before the screaming headlines could permanently distort the truth of what had happened behind the locked doors. The public explosion occurred at exactly midday when a partial copy of the signed emergency declaration was leaked directly to a national broadcaster, sending immediate shockwaves through every newsroom in the country. Within minutes, the carefully managed silence of the palace was shattered by screaming headlines that reduced years of intense, private institutional tension to a few brutal words. The broadcast media went into a state of total frenzy, interrupting regular programming to bring on constitutional commentators who openly argued over whether Prince George's sudden, unprecedented designation meant that Prince William had been quietly pushed aside. This false and incredibly dangerous public narrative threatened to turn an internal security measure into a full-scale constitutional crisis as crowds began to gather against the iron gates of Buckingham Palace, demanding clarity. Prince William understood instantly that the chaos unfolding outside the walls could permanently poison the internal relationship between the two factions of the family if it was left to fester for even another hour. He made the immediate, executive decision to bypass the official press office entirely, arranging a direct, face-to-face confrontation with Queen Camilla in the absolute privacy of the Windsor Library. There were no lawyers, no private secretaries, and no medical advisors present to soften the blow. It was a final, unyielding meeting between the future king and the woman who had spent decades trying to secure her family's place within the royal structure. The confrontation inside the library was defined not by shouting, but by a cold, clinical exposure of the reality that had brought the monarchy to the brink of a public collapse. Prince William sat opposite his stepmother and stated clearly that he had not come to demand an apology or to gloat over the legal victory his solicitors had achieved across the private estates. He had come because his son, a 9-year-old boy, should not have to inherit a sovereign institution that had been permanently fractured and poisoned by decisions made secretly in his name. Queen Camilla, visibly shaken by the rapid and total destruction of her household infrastructure, reportedly admitted that her years of being treated as an intruder by the old guard had fundamentally changed her perspective. She confessed that she had become completely determined that Tom and Laura would never be made to feel invisible or discarded beside the official royal family, and in her desperate push to secure their personal dignity, she had failed to realize how the liaison proposal threatened the sovereign independence of the direct line. The intention, she claimed, had been about family acceptance, but the legal reality had felt to William and Catherine like an unmitigated institutional intrusion. Then, in a moment that completely shifted the dynamic of the entire conflict, Queen Camilla reached into a secure drawer, pulled out the original handwritten Windsor memorandum, and tore the pages into pieces directly in front of the Prince of Wales. She gave her binding, personal word that no member of her family would ever again be proposed for any administrative, financial, or consultative role involving Prince George's household or the future management of the crown properties. Her voice reportedly shook with intense emotional exhaustion, but the strategic surrender was absolute and undeniable. William responded by establishing a clear, permanent boundary that balanced institutional security with basic human decency, confirming that Tom and Laura would not be completely erased from the private, personal life of the family. They would still receive invitations to private birthdays, family dinners, and holiday gatherings that carried no official authority, but the emergency declaration protecting the succession line would remain unrevised, locked in the archives as a permanent legal firewall. Camilla asked for only one final concession. She demanded that William stand publicly beside the king to state clearly to the world that her children had never actively sought the throne, a regency, or personal control over his son. The implementation of this public truce required a massive, coordinated effort from the remaining senior staff members, who had to completely rewrite the palace's media strategy within a matter of minutes. By mid-afternoon, the official press room was prepared for an extraordinary briefing, an event so rare that it drew the immediate attention of every major international news network. Queen Camilla stood silently behind the closed doors for several long moments, asking King Charles whether standing beside him during such a stark clarification would make her appear completely defeated to the public. The king, whose physical exhaustion was evident, but whose resolve had been solidified by the day's events, answered softly that standing together would show the nation that the monarchy had survived a profound internal disagreement without pretending the conflict had never occurred. When the doors finally opened, the king delivered the clarification himself, confirming to the assembled press corps that the constitutional order remained entirely unchanged. Prince William was the immediate, direct heir to the throne, and the new emergency declaration existed solely to ensure that private family relationships could never be exploited to create alternative centers of royal authority. William then honored his private promise to his stepmother, stepping forward to deliver a highly disciplined statement that systematically dismantled the wild media speculation regarding Tom and Laura's intentions. He stated clearly that the Queen's children had never sought constitutional power, emergency advisory roles, or any form of guardianship over Prince George, and he emphasized that the new legal provisions should not be interpreted by the public as an accusation of personal wrongdoing. The purpose of the document was defensive and institutional, designed to eliminate the gray areas of the law before they could be used to disrupt the stability of the next generation. At Windsor, Princess Catherine watched the live broadcast beside her son, quietly turning down the television volume the moment the commentators began discussing Prince George as an abstract state institution rather than a young child. George, sensing the immense structural weight shifting around him, asked his mother whether the shouting crowds outside the gates were angry with him, prompting the princess to assure him that the public was simply reacting to adult decisions and that he carried absolutely no blame for the family's choices. The emotional climax of that historic day occurred later that evening during a private chapel service within the secured grounds of the estate, a moment that was captured by a single, distant pool photographer. As the family walked toward the entrance, Prince William placed a firm, steadying hand on his son's shoulder, a simple but incredibly powerful gesture that instantly became the defining symbol of the entire crisis. It was the visual manifestation of a father shielding his boy from the immense, crushing weight of his historical future, signaling to the world that the direct line of succession was completely protected by a generation that refused to compromise on duty. Behind them, the signed declaration was officially logged into the permanent royal archives, placed within a secure vault where it would remain beyond the reach of future private persuasion, emotional pressure, or administrative manipulation. The internal war that had threatened to tear the modern blended family apart had been brought to an absolute, unyielding end by a system that valued structural permanence far above personal comfort. Inside the quiet offices of the sovereign study, King Charles sat alone after the departure of the legal teams, touching the heavy vintage pen he had used to sign the emergency instrument earlier that morning. When Queen Camilla entered the room, he admitted to her that if he had possessed the courage to enforce these strict boundaries much earlier in his reign, they would have all been spared the deep public humiliation of the past week. His long-standing habit of permitting ambiguity to maintain domestic peace had allowed private expectations to grow into a legitimate constitutional danger, but he refused to apologize for the final decision. A reigning monarch who avoids a difficult boundary simply leaves a much more dangerous vulnerability for their successors to inherit, and his primary duty was to hand down a crown that was completely free from internal contradiction. Camilla did not argue, her initial fury having softened into a quiet, somber acceptance of the reality that protecting her children from feeling excluded could never justify placing them near responsibilities that legally belonged to William and George. Before retiring for the night, Prince William visited his son's bedroom to deliver a quiet explanation that would permanently settle the young boy's mind after hours of national upheaval. He sat on the edge of the bed and explained that being named so prominently in the emergency declaration did not mean that his childhood was coming to a sudden end, nor did it mean that the throne was approaching any faster than before. The family had simply made a solemn, legally binding promise to him that no one would ever be allowed to use personal affection, constitutional uncertainty, or a national emergency to control his future household or dictate his choices. George listened quietly, his mind processing the immense reality of the protective firewall his father had built around him, before looking up to ask whether he still had to attend his standard school lessons the following morning. William smiled for the very first time on that exhausting day, assuring his son that the rules of his daily life remained absolute before turning off the light and leaving the young heir to the peaceful sleep of a secure childhood. In the final hours of the night, Princess Catherine stood alone before the fireplace in the private sitting room, holding the original handwritten note she had taken during the fateful Windsor meeting months earlier. She looked at the specific dates, the tracking signatures, and the exact wording that had first exposed the hidden paper trail of the alternative household expansion. With a calm, deliberate motion, she placed the paper directly into the center of the flames, watching the ink char and turn to ash because the warning it preserved was no longer needed by the caretakers of a line. The crisis had forced every member of the institution to pay a profound personal price, but the structural integrity of the crown had emerged completely compromised and entirely secure. King Charles had fulfilled his historic vow by limiting his own household. Prince William had successfully defended his son without resorting to personal revenge, and Queen Camilla had accepted a painful boundary that wounded her pride but ultimately prevented a much deeper permanent fracture. The Great Emergency Declaration of 2026 did not rewrite the ancient laws of the British realm, but it ensured that whenever Prince George's historical moment finally arrives, he will step forward to inherit a crown that has been completely purified of the ambiguities that nearly divided his family before him. And that, my friends, is how the ultimate royal chessboard maneuver was executed in absolute silence. It wasn't a reality TV screaming match. It was a cold-blooded, high-stakes legal execution that permanently separated the crown's power from personal affection. Prince George is officially secured. The direct bloodline has erected an untouchable legal firewall, and Queen Camilla's inner circle has been thoroughly, systematically, and permanently pushed outside the gates of royal authority. But now, the real conversation begins with you. Did Prince William and Princess make the right call by executing this brutal dynastic purge to safeguard a 9-year-old boy's future? Or do you think the explicit, named exclusion of Tom and Laura was an unnecessarily cruel, public humiliation for a family that never even asked for the throne in the first place? Is King Charles a weak monarch who let his household get compromised, or a responsible king who finally chose duty over his own domestic peace? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I want to see a massive debate on this one because the House of Cards has officially collapsed, and everyone is paying a different price for the clarity. If you found this deep dive investigation gripping, smash that like button, share this video with every royal watcher you know, and most importantly, hit that subscribe button right now. Turn on your notifications so you don't miss the next fast-moving constitutional truth update on Crown Watch. Thank you for watching, and we will see you on the next one.